Yeah, yes. So what better time than Hanukkah to bring light to? Well, I think it's a lovely day to choose to commemorate a memory of somebody so beloved. So last week we looked at books 1 and books 2 of book 2 of Maccabees, and we saw that 1 looks like quite a good candidate to be read on Hanukkah. It was originally in Hebrew, and it tells the Hanukkah story. There's no doubt about it. It's our main historical source. Indeed, that's our main source altogether for Hanukkah. Then we went on to Maccabees 2, and we saw that was very different. That doesn't seem to have had a Hebrew original. It was originally written in Greek. And while it did cover 15 years of the Hanukkah story, it focused far more on miracle stories, on, again, I'm not saying it rudely, but it's a species of religious propaganda. It's trying to tell you about the moral aspects, the message of the festival, much more than to record what actually happened. So a very different sort of book. And we have 2 equally different books this week. It is a bit of a wonder. They're all called Maccabees, really, especially number 3. And we'll notice that they are also different. I think what the difference is showing us is that just as today, there were different ways of reacting to Jewish texts and messages back in the Hellenistic period, that people understood festivals and messages in separate ways, in different ways, sometimes complementary ways, sometimes quite opposed ways. And I think there is a lesson to us. Sometimes we look around at the diversity of the Jewish world today and we think, oh, it's just modern times. It looks as though it goes all the way back, certainly to Hellenistic times. Jews understood their faith in very, very different ways back then. So that's quite an interesting thing to get out of comparing the 4 books. So we will march on to the 3rd book of Maccabees. And it has to be said, this is the odd one out. It was written in Greek. It was originally written in Greek. It's called the 3rd book of Maccabees, but it has nothing whatsoever to do with the Maccabees or the Hanukkah story or the history behind it. And it doesn't even pretend to do that. It's actually an explanation of why the Jews of Egypt came to celebrate a Purim-like festival in the summer, nothing to do with Kislev at all. And we'll look at it in a little bit more detail. It's written in a very elaborate, florid style of Greek, and it seems to have been written in Egypt, and it's probably from the 1st century CE, which is a little bit after the events of Hanukkah, which you'll remember kicked off in 167 BCE. So to give you an idea of the story recorded in the book, it starts with the Egyptian king, who's a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Ptolemy IV, who was a real figure and reigned from about 221 to 204 BCE. And he has embroiled himself in a war with the king of the Seleucid dynasty, Antiochus III, who is the father of our Antiochus IV from the Hanukkah story. So it's before Hanukkah happens. And they have a battle at Raphia, which is on the border between their territories. It's modern Rafah in the Gaza Strip. And during this battle, a disloyal follower of the Egyptian king tries to murder him, but he is saved by Dositheus, a Jew who is in his employment. And he's obviously a very Hellenistic type of Jew. He follows a Greek type of Greek way of life. Again, we know this is true of the Egyptian Jewish community. They spoke Greek and they were very much integrated into their surroundings. So in some ways, a little bit like Megillat Esther, somebody who's outside the land of Israel and part of the life around them. And that all looks very nice. But unfortunately, after his victory, King Ptolemy goes off to Jerusalem, and where, in spite of having been rescued by this Jewish hero Dositheus, the king insists on entering the temple, going into the sanctuary in spite of huge, huge protests. And of course, God punishes him and he's struck down and he has to be dragged out of the temple by his guards. He recovers, he returns to Egypt, and there he forgets all about the Jew who saved him, and he vows to take vengeance on the Jews for his humiliation in Jerusalem. And he announces that any Jews who accept initiation into the cult of the god Dionysius will receive full citizenship at Alexandria, which was where the main Jewish settlement was. Anyone who refuses will be registered for the poll tax and branded as a slave. So about 300 Jews accept his conditions and enter the cult of Dionysius, but the vast majority of the Jewish people in Egypt refuse, and they would rather be badly treated than actually forsake their covenant with God. And Ptolemy is furious, and he decides he'll round up all the Egyptian Jews in a nearby hippodrome and execute them. And this is where we're going to have a little look at what actually happens in the book itself. So here we are. And you can see the structure is fairly simple. The story I've just told you, the Egyptian king Ptolemy IV is struck down and vows vengeance. Then the bit we're going to get to, the king persecutes the Jews of Egypt and tries to destroy them. And quite predictably for a Jewish book, God foils the king's plans. And in the end, the king changes his mind, which is at the end of the book. So this is really from the persecutory stage of things. Okay, so we'll just sample this. In every place then, where this decree arrived, a feast at public expense was arranged for the Gentiles with shouts and gladness. For the inveterate enmity which had long ago been in their minds was now made evident and outspoken. But among the Jews there was incessant mourning, lamentation, and tearful cries. Everywhere their hearts were burning, and they groaned because of the unexpected destruction that had suddenly been decreed from them. Some of this is quite reminiscent of Esther, by the way. What district or city, what habitable place at all, or what streets were not filled with mourning and wailing for them? For with such a harsh and ruthless spirit were they being sent off altogether by the generals in the several cities, that at the sight of their unusual punishments, even some of their enemies, perceiving the common object of pity before their eyes, reflected upon the uncertainty of life and shed tears at the most miserable expulsion of these people. For a multitude of grey-headed old men, sluggish and bent with age, was being led away, forced to march at a swift pace by the violence with which they were driven in such a shameful manner. And young women who had just entered the bridal chamber to share married life exchanged joy for wailing, their myrrh-perfumed hair sprinkled with ashes, and they were carried away unveiled, altogether raising a lament instead of a wedding song, as they were torn by the harsh treatment of the heathen. In bonds and in public view, they were violently dragged along as far as the place of embarkation. And apparently they're all sent off for various cities by sea to this place where they're going to be rounded up. Their husbands, in the prime of youth, their necks encircled with ropes instead of garlands, spent the remaining days of their marriage festival in lamentations instead of good cheer and youthful revelry, seeing death immediately before them. They were brought on board like wild animals, driven under the constraint of iron bonds. Some were fastened by the neck to the benches of the boats, others had their feet secured by unbreakable fetters, and in addition they were confined under a solid deck, so that with their eyes in total darkness they should undergo treatment befitting traitors during the whole voyage. When these men had been brought to the place called Scedia, and the voyage was concluded as the king had decreed, he commanded that they should be enclosed in the hippodrome, which had been built with a monstrous perimeter wall in front of the city, and which was well suited to make them an obvious spectacle to all coming back into the city, and to those from the city going out into the country, so that they could neither communicate with the king's forces, nor in any way claim to be inside the circuit of the city. So you can see it's very dramatic. It's full of description. It takes absolutely ages to get to the point. It's very much a Greek document of its times. This is what Hellenistic literature is like. And the evoking of emotion, the sort of pathetic the spectacle that invites the reader to be sad and upset at it too is, again, very, very typical. It's altogether an emotional text in a way that no text in the Tanach is. The Tanakh doesn't tell you to be sad. The Tanakh just represents facts or incidents, and it's up to you how to react to them much more. But here the reaction is sort of dictated by the way the writer has actually composed this scene. Rather oddly, slightly weirdly, really, it's reminiscent of a very famous incident during the Holocaust, when Jews in Paris were rounded up in the Vel d'Hiver, which was a huge bicycle velodrome. And they were from there, most of them were deported to Auschwitz. That happened in 1942, and over 13,000 Jews were actually rounded up. And it's remarkably reminiscent, this idea that the Jews are sort of rounded up into a hippodrome and then they're going to be executed. So at this point in the story, God begins to act. And we see this in various miraculous ways. When the lists of Jews to be executed are being compiled, the king's agents run out of pens and paper, and some Jews actually escape. Ptolemy orders his war elephants to be brought into the hippodrome to trample the Jews to death, but then he oversleeps and he misses the time for the execution, and then he forgets what he was going to do, and then he accuses his courtiers of plotting against the Jews. So he's just totally mentally confused. And on the third day, however, he remembers his orders and he finally issues them again. But as the elephants advance, an old priest called Eleazar offers a public prayer, which has a rather surprising result. So we'll look at the little section about Eleazar, who appears, by the way, in various other of these texts, and I think he's in Second Maccabees, and certainly in Fourth Maccabees. So just as Eleazar was ending his prayer, which is that God will save them, the king arrived at the hippodrome with the beasts and all the arrogance of his forces. And when the Jews observed this, they raised great cries to heaven, so that even the nearby valleys resounded with them and brought an uncontrollable terror upon the army. Then the most glorious, almighty, and true God revealed his holy face and opened the heavenly gates, from which two glorious angels of fearful aspect descended, visible to all but the Jews. They opposed the forces of the enemy and filled them with confusion and terror, binding them with immovable shackles. Even the king began to shudder bodily, and he forgot his sullen insolence. The beasts, this is the elephants, turned back upon the armed forces following them and began trampling and destroying them. Then the king's anger was turned to pity and tears because of the things he had devised beforehand. So the king changes his mind, he repents. Once again, he blames his courtiers, rather unfairly. Then he releases the Jews, he provides for a 7-day feast for them, which becomes an annual festival, and he issues a decree protecting their rights. And he also allows the Jews to execute the 300 of their number who had joined up to the cult of Dionysius. And he also then wipes out all the decrees, and everything ends happily, and the Jews are restored to their possessions and their honorable place in society. Well, it's a lovely story, very reminiscent of Purim in some ways, but it's got nothing whatsoever to do with Hanukkah, as you can see. Really, really odd. So it's an Egyptian story, basically. It happens 50 years before the Maccabees. Some of the manuscripts that contain it don't call it Third Book of Maccabees, they call it Ptolemaica, the story at the time of the Ptolemies, and that actually would be a much better title for it. Our earliest copies come from the Codex Alexandrinus, a big Greek manuscript Bible from the 5th century, the Codex Venatus, which is 9th century. But this story, this whole book, does not appear in our earliest copies of the Greek Bible, like Codex Sinaiticus or Codex Vaticanus. So it just seems to have not been preserved quite as such a majority thing, should we say. Even the Christians were a bit iffy about it. And Jews weren't interested, I think, not beyond the period of which it really was composed and was being circulated for maybe a century or two. We don't know who wrote it. The author has left no particular traces. Some scholars would put it in the late 2nd century BCE, so right after the Hanukkah events, maybe, partly because there are some links to 2 Maccabees, for instance, the sighting of Eleazar, who's a hero in that too. And it also has links to a book, a document called the Letter of Aristeas, which is about the translation of the Bible into Greek by the Jews of Egypt, the Septuagint. So again, stylistic and other little bits seem to say maybe it comes from that time, which also would argue for it being an Egyptian document and not having been written in the land of Israel at all. Some scholars would put it in the Roman period even. So it does have some main themes that you can see perhaps why it was grouped with the other 3 books, the other 3 books that are about Maccabees. The main theme really is loyalty to Torah always is the best policy. God protects Jews wherever they are, inside or outside the land of Israel. Non-Jewish hatred of Judaism is unfounded and evil. These are all very much diaspora messages. Again, these are messages you can pick out once more in the book of Esther. And so it does seem that this is purely an Egyptian book. It might even be a sort of parallel story to the story of the Maccabees, something that was written to do a story that was much more local. It reinforces boundaries between Jews and non-Jews. And just as it documents the senseless and vicious hatred of the non-Jews in the story for Jews, it also has a very low opinion of non-Jews. They're shown as lawless and abominable and ignorant of the truth. So I wouldn't say it's not exactly a landmark document about brotherly love in any sense at all. The question arises, is it historical? Even if it's nothing to do with the Maccabees, maybe this incident happened. We can trace some of the characters, like King Ptolemy IV definitely existed. To Scythius, there's some evidence for the Jewish hero of the first part. And Josephus, the historian who recorded the destruction of the Second Temple, he lived through it himself, and his Jewish Antiquities and Jewish War are our main historical sources for this period. He does talk about a similar episode. It has elephants, it has the hippodrome where everyone is rounded up, but it's a different king. Instead of Ptolemy IV, it's Ptolemy VIII, who's much later, 146 to 117 BCE, which is after the Hanukkah story. And Ptolemy VIII apparently had the Jews who supported his sister, Cleopatra II, in a coup. He had them all rounded up and killed. In this case, to the elephants turn on the king's soldiers, and eventually he made peace with the Jews. So it's a bit similar. And Josephus records that the Egyptian Jews had their own festival to remember this event. So maybe there is some historical core there, because that's quite interesting that it appears in Josephus as well. Again, it's very much a window on the relationship between Jews and non-Jews in the Hellenistic period. The Jews suspected by and suspicious of their Greek neighbors, very much at the mercy of kings, convinced that God was protecting them as long as they remained loyal to the Torah. And it throws light also on the non-Jewish position, the very widespread Hellenistic concept of civil religion, which is the duty of all citizens, whoever they worship in private, that's their business, but all citizens are meant to participate in public worship and public rituals to keep the city safe. And in many places in the ancient world, Jews were conspicuous and quite odd for refusing to join in. For the Jews, it was idolatry. For the local citizens, it was just rather dangerous, withdrawing the hem of your garments from being part of the community. And they didn't really get it at all. And the two most common accusations about Jews at this time was atheism, because they kept denying the existence of gods. Obviously, that didn't count, okay, they had their own God, but they were denying everybody else's God, so that looked like atheism to ancient people. And the other accusation was that the Jews hated everybody else. They were misanthropists and didn't like anybody at all. And again, that was founded on this idea that they won't join in our communal rituals. And these rituals are for the safety of everybody in the city, and you can't just back out like that. It would be like not paying your insurance or something if you live in a communal building. So we can see there's a lot of mutual misunderstanding going on here. So this is an interesting book, but I have to say there was no chance this was going to get into the Bible. No way, far too late, only in Greek, about a local Egyptian incident. Yeah, you could get away with it with the Book of Esther, but not at this period. And just no, nothing to do with the Maccabees. So book 3 is the joker in the pack, if you like. Book 3 was clearly never going to be a candidate. What about book 4? I hear you crying. Once again, we have a different take on what it meant to be Jewish in the Hellenistic period, with all its challenges and seductions. And this book is the latest of the set. It probably comes from the mid-1st century BCE, so about 50 BCE, around there somewhere. And it's not clear where it was written, somewhere in the Eastern diaspora communities. Could have been Egypt, could have been Syria, could even have been Cilicia, which is part of modern Turkey. And again, we don't know who the author was. It was written in an extremely elaborate and flowery Greek, rather like book 3. And it's a different proposition once again. It's really a philosophical tract, and it tries to prove that reason can rule people's emotions, and that reason can inspire people even to die rather than give up their faith. This is not an irrational reaction to persecution. This is the most reasonable course of all. And the book claims that this is the true path that gives individuals honor and everlasting reward. It's not very interested in the historical or the military side of the Hanukkah story and what the Maccabees did or what they didn't do. It does, however, reuse the martyr stories from book 2, especially the mother with the 7 sons that we sampled last week, And it uses those to serve as examples and prove the philosophical position that it's taking. And the whole thing is organized, again, very much like a philosophical tract. So we have a prologue with the thesis, reason can control the emotions. Then we move on to all sorts of examples from the Tanach. We'll look at one or two of those. Then we have examples from contemporary history or very recent history, including the Hasmonean revolt. So this is where the Maccabees come in. And then it ends up with an exhortation that everyone should follow all these people's examples. So very nicely organized. But again, this is an example of religious propaganda. Again, not in a nasty sense. This is written for a religious purpose, quite different from Maccabees 1, which is an account of what happened. So we'll start with the declaration of purpose, because that's quite interesting and I think really gives you a flavor of what this book is about. And the author starts, the subject that I'm about to discuss is most philosophical, that is, whether devout reason is sovereign over the emotions. So it is right for me to advise you to pay earnest attention to philosophy. For the subject is essential to everyone who is seeking knowledge. And in addition, it includes praise of the highest virtue. I mean, of course, rational judgment. If then it is evident that reason rules over those emotions that hinder self-control, namely gluttony and lust, it is also clear that it masters the emotions that hinder one from justice, such as malice, and those that stand in the way of courage, namely anger, fear, and pain. Some might perhaps ask, if reason rules the emotions, why is it not sovereign over forgetfulness and ignorance? Their attempted argument is ridiculous, for reason does not rule its own emotions, but those that are opposed to justice, courage, and self-control. And it is not for the purpose of destroying them, but so that one may not give way to them. I could prove to you from many and various examples that reason is dominant over the emotions, but I can demonstrate it best from the noble bravery of those who died for the sake of virtue, Eleazar and the 7 brothers and their mothers, who of course all appear in Maccabees 2. All of these, by despising sufferings that bring death, demonstrated that reason controls the emotions. On this anniversary, it is fitting for me to praise for their virtues those who, with their mother, died for the sake of nobility and goodness. But I would also call them blessed for the honor in which they are held. For all people, even their torturers, marveled at their courage and endurance, and they became the cause of the downfall of tyranny over their nation. By their endurance, they conquered the tyrant, and thus their native land was purified through them. I shall shortly have an opportunity to speak of this, but as my custom is, I shall begin by stating my main principle, and then I shall turn to their story, giving glory to the all-wise God. I think that really gives you a flavor of this very measured, philosophical, logical treatise that this is. He presents his thesis, reason enables us to choose wisdom, and then he goes on to prove it with examples. He also claims that you acquire that reason as a direct result of being educated in Torah. In turn, that allows us to act with what the Greek moralists regarded as the 4 cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, courage, and temperance. And those 4 appear all the way through the book, and actually we've seen some mentions of them already. And again, this is not unique to this author. The Greeks generally, the philosophical side of the Greeks, I'm not sure about the common people, did feel that reason should rule emotions, and they had it down to quite a fine science. And they felt that proper education could give you the mental tools to control what they called the pathe, which is at the root of pathological. The pathe was quite a complex idea, meaning all the emotions and passions and senses that the Greeks thought were innate in human beings, and what we might call instincts and innate behaviors. And they thought that those things had to be controlled in order for people to live a virtuous life. So we have an extremely Greek idea at the center here. It's slightly ironical when we think of the contrast between, Judaismos and Hellenismos that we saw in 2 Maccabees, the Hellenisticness as opposed to Judaism. Here we have Hellenistic identity and Hellenismos at the very center of a Jewish author telling you how great the Torah is. Because the author is telling us that this control, this very Greek idea of control over your pathé, over all your base instincts, can only be conveyed by the Torah and the Jewish way of life. And only that can give us the training in devout reason that will enable us to control all these wild and unreliable instincts and emotions and impulses that we have. So after his introduction, the author goes on and he cites stories from Tanach, and particularly that of Joseph. Of course, we saw that just this week in the Parsha. Joseph is praised for overcoming desire and following the path of devout reason, because he rejects the advances made to him by Potiphar's wife. He could have just answered his bodily urges and given in, but no, he used reason and he resisted. Also talks about Moses, who overcame his anger towards the rebels Dathan and Abiram by means of reason, and he dealt with them according to reason. And this is contrasted by the author with Jacob's words, "Cursed be their anger," when he talks about his sons Shimon and Levi slaughtering the inhabitants of Shechem after their sister Dinah has been abducted and raped, which the author sees as giving into anger. They did the wrong thing, and how do we know it's the wrong thing? Jacob says, "Cursed be their anger." So clearly they didn't use their reason to overcome their emotions. So we'll have a little look at a couple of these, especially the Moshe one. And this is the way he's using Tanakh to undergird his thesis. He says, when Moses was angry with Dathan and Abiram, he did nothing against them in anger, but controlled his anger by reason. For as I have said, the temperate mind is able to get the better of the emotions, to correct some and to render others powerless. Why else did Jacob, our most wise father, censure the households of Simeon and Levi for their irrational slaughter of the entire tribe of the Shechemites, saying, "Cursed be their anger"? For if reason could not control anger, he would not have spoken thus. Now, when God fashioned human beings, he planted in them emotions and inclinations, but at the same time, he enthroned the mind among the senses as a sacred governor over them all. To the mind, he gave the law, Torah. The one who is subject to this will rule a kingdom that is temperate, just, good, and courageous. So he's proved his point. So it's a very fascinating use of biblical text to support a very, very Greek philosophy about the virtuous life and virtuous behavior. And actually, it's a superb example of sort of syncretistic Hellenistic and Jewish ideas working together very, very well. And quite convincingly, if you happen to be, a Hellenistic intellectual, this would speak to you very, very clearly. Note also that the negative example here of Shimon and Levi slaughtering the inhabitants of Shechem is an unusual case of Jews attacking non-Jews. So here, by condemning it, he is subtly implying that's not a thing you should be doing. And we know there were countless fights and riots between Jews and Greeks, particularly in the Egyptian city of Alexandria. There was a lot of tension between the two communities, and there were quite a lot of physical attacks in both directions, I might add there. So perhaps this is part of his reason for writing this book, to try and calm things down a bit. So after he's warmed up his readers with biblical examples, he then moves on to much more recent history and the persecution of the Jews by Antiochus IV and Maccabean history, or Hasmonean history. And this sets the stage for his main examples in support of his argument. And he goes through the stories of the aged priest Eleazar, who we didn't actually sample in the second book of Maccabees, but he is there, and the mother and her 7 sons, which we did sample from 2 Maccabees. And all of them prefer martyrdom to abandoning the one true God and his law. So the author wants to show that their behavior, far from being extreme or fanatic or strange, is the only possible course dictated by reason in the face of the unreasonable nature of the king's persecution. So again, they are upholding his thesis, upholding the sovereign position of reason. And each character makes long philosophical speeches, which I think we will not sample because they go on forever, And there are even sort of hypothetical speeches that might have been presented by the martyrs if they decided to accept the king's demand. So this is what they could have said. And then he gives a long speech. They didn't, though. They used their reason. So these serve as counter arguments, and the author can then pick holes in them and say, but this would not be according to reason. So the raw material comes from Second Maccabees, apparently, which is earlier, but it's been vastly expanded. So in Second Maccabees, the mother, as we saw, we actually sampled this bit, she only speaks for a few verses at the end. She doesn't really say very much. In Fourth Maccabees, her speech lasts for 4 chapters. And no, we're not going to sample it. It's just too long. The book ends up with the author's praise for the martyrs, and he notes that they defeated the wicked tyrant by their endurance and steadfastness. And he then encourages the audience of the book to imitate their courage and their determination to follow God and to obey his Torah. And this clearly is the purpose of the book. It's aimed at encouraging Jews in the diaspora under foreign domination to cling to their faith in a world where sometimes that's a terrible challenge, and where the majority culture regards them as odd, foolish, and out of touch with the central values of Greek culture, which sort of rings a bell, quite very much in many ways a problem that we still have. So ironically, though, even though the preservation and the pursuit of Judaism and the justification of Judaism is the central theme of the book, the entire argument and the rhetorical methods used are absolutely Greek and very much of their time. The book was clearly heavily influenced by Stoic and Platonic philosophy. The Stoics, for instance, had an ideal of living in accordance with nature's law. Our author takes that idea and he shows that since God created nature and God gave the laws of nature, obviously the laws that God gave to the Jews are the best guide to virtue, since they come from the universal lawgiver. So again, takes a very, very Greek idea and gives it a bit of a Jewish twist here. Interestingly, God is also understood as the ultimate patron. And the patron-client relationship was really important in the Hellenistic world, in the Roman world too. And the idea was the patron, who was usually rich and high up in society, would give favors and support to their clients, the people who came and asked for favors from them. And in turn, the clients would support their patrons, express their gratitude, do favors back for them when they could, and serve them, and never bring them into dishonor. And in this book, for this author, that's why Jews are obliged to demonstrate their loyalty to God by never abandoning his Torah in gratitude for all the wonderful things that he has done for them. So it's better to be a martyr than betray your divine patron. It's very much understood in Greek terms. And another fascinating theological feature of the book is its use of the idea of what's sometimes called substitutionary atonement or vicarious atonement, the idea that the martyrs suffer in order to arouse God to forgive the rest of the people. And their sufferings and their death expiate the sins of the rest of the Jewish people. And in the book, Eleazar, the aged priest who gets martyred, expresses it in this way. When he was now burned to his very bones and about to expire, he lifted up his eyes to God and said, "You know, O God, that though I might have saved myself, I am dying in burning torments for the sake of the law. Be merciful to your people, and let our punishment suffice for them. Make my blood their purification, and take my life in exchange for theirs." So that's a very clear statement, please heap all their sins upon me, forgive their sins for my sake, I am paying with my blood. That might sound quite familiar. That's exactly the idea that Christians later developed about Jesus suffering on the cross for their sins, taking away the sins of the world. They valued 4 Maccabees very, very highly in the Christian world, and it's quite possible that idea came from 4 Maccabees and was then reused or modified in certain ways. And we can find other parallels with early Christian texts. Some of the imagery used, particularly the image of the martyr as an athlete in a race, competing and winning contest of virtue. So we'll look at the Maccabees text first, and we'll compare it with the text of the New Testament. So this is the first bit is, I think, the mother speaking to her sons, and she says, "My sons, noble is the contest to which you are called to bear witness for the nation. Fight zealously for our ancestral law. Reverence for God was victor in the contest and gave the crown of victory to its own athletes. Who did not admire the athletes of the divine legislation? So this is the martyr as the athlete of God. And here from 1 Corinthians, New Testament, we have, do you not know that in a race, all the runners compete, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we are spiritual athletes to receive an imperishable wreath, i.e. the Christian's resurrection and life in the next world. So it's quite amazing that we have this metaphor of the martyr as an athlete actually being reused in the New Testament. And it's one of the things that shows us that though the New Testament to modern Jews is quite alien in a lot of its thinking, it wasn't always that alien to Hellenistic Jews. It did actually incorporate ideas that Jews themselves had picked up and had developed from the culture in which they lived. And it's worth remembering that in spite of our modern emphasis on the Jews against the Greeks, all the Jews living at the time were also living in a Hellenistic world, just as all Jews living right now are living in a modern world. And you can be, you know, in as closed a Jewish sect as you want, you're still part of the modern world, and you're still reacting to it, and you're still using parts of it or transmuting parts of it. And that was true of Greeks, of Jews and Greek or Hellenistic culture back then. Another metaphor that again got picked up and used in the Christian world was that of martyrs as soldiers. You might know the very famous Christian hymn, Onward Christian Soldiers. And 4 Maccabees also refers to the martyrs as soldiers of God very much in that way too. So here we have another response, yet another response to the dominant Hellenistic culture of the time, using its own ideas and methods to assert that Judaism has all the answers and embodies all the virtue, even according to Hellenistic ideas. So with these 4 books, we've seen a variety of ways in which the Jews of the Hellenistic period tried to come to terms with being a minority in that world, often a despised or misunderstood minority. We've seen how they found ways of telling themselves that they were at the top of the heap and not with the dregs at the bottom, which they sometimes felt they were or were told they were. We've seen how they used these texts and they used these ideas to keep themselves strong and enduring in their faith, and how they accounted both for their fortunes and their misfortunes. And some of their ideas are still very much with us. Others are very, very much of their own time. But the entire enterprise of preserving your self-respect and your confidence as a minority in an overwhelming culture around you is still very much a theme that is with us. And particularly, we often think about this at Hanukkah, and here we see these texts doing the same thinking, but about 2,000 years ago, which is quite amazing. So I think we can agree that the 3rd book of Maccabees was never going to make it into the Bible. But now we need to go back to our original question and say, okay, maybe not number 3, but what about 1, 2, and 4? Why aren't any of those in the Bible, so that we have some text that's canonical that we can read at Hanukkah, as we can for every other festival? And here we've got several factors. I think they probably all combine. I wouldn't isolate just one of them. I think they're very much connected. And the first is the question of date. Now, the later you get, the less biblical you are, really, because obviously the biblical period ends, and also things just don't sound biblical anymore. And we've seen that 1 Maccabees was the one probably composed first, 2 Maccabees shortly thereafter, or roughly in the same period. 3 Maccabees looks later, and 4th Maccabees looks latest of all. And there's another reason why date is important, because this is also the period when the Tanach was being canonized or closed. The idea of a canon actually comes from Hebrew kaneh, a reed. It's like a measuring stick. Does this book measure up to what we expect of a holy book? So the process of canonization really is deciding, is the book in our holy writings or is it not in our holy writings? And we know from several rabbinic texts at this time, or a bit later, that this question went on for a long time. Torah was obviously in from the beginning. Books of the Nevi'im were just about in from the beginning, from when they were written. The last prophets were Haggai, Malachi, and Zechariah, and they're around about 500 BCE, roughly when the Second Temple is being is being rebuilt. So it's unlikely that anything after that period is going to get into into the section called Nevi'im, the prophetic books of the Tanakh. But the last box, the Ketuvim or writing box, stayed open for a surprising amount of time. And we can see that the first two were a done deal and the third wasn't. Again, from the New Testament, which constantly talks about the law and the prophets, which is Torah and Nevi'im, never mentions Ketuvim because it's not a closed box yet. And we have rabbinic evidence that shows us quite clearly from the Mishnah onwards that certain books were disputed. They tended to be the same books again and again. Mishle, well, everyone's convinced that that's part of a holy book and should be in there. Shir HaShirim was disputed, and very famously, Rabbi Akiva, who was roughly Bar Kochba time, so around 130, 135 CE, still feels compelled to defend Shir HaShirim and say it is Kodesh HaKodeshim, of the holy of holies of all writings. Nobody ever disputed it, which goes against the evidence of the Mishnah, which shows that plenty of people disputed it and said it shouldn't be in. Sometimes Kohelet is disputed. And we see in numerous texts from the Mishnah and later that there was argument about what should go in, what became to be known as Ketuvim and what shouldn't go. What's also very interesting is we know about one book that almost got in but didn't, and that is the book of Ben Sirach, known as Ecclesiasticus in English, which is different from Ecclesiastes, which is Kohelet. So this is not in our Tanach. This is in the Christian Apocrypha. The Apocrypha is like 1 and 2 Maccabees. The Apocrypha is a set of books that are preserved in Greek in some of the Christian churches, not all, but were written by Jews before Christianity, but that Jews were not interested in. So Ben Sirach is right in there along with 1 and 2 Maccabees. But we also have Ben Sirach being quoted 3 times in the Talmud, preceded by the words dichtiv, as it is written, or shene'emah, as it is said. Those are both markers for biblical quotes. So it's quite clear that as late as some of the early layers of the Talmud, there were people who thought Ben Sirach was in the box. But equally, there were people who were quite sure that Ben Sirach was out of the box. And this becomes important because we know when Ben Sirach was written, it tells us, and it was about 180 BCE. But you have, for instance, from the Tosefta, which is a document rather like the Mishnah, and academics are still arguing if it's slightly earlier or slightly later than the Mishnah. The Mishnah is about 200 CE, so somewhere around then. And it says very clearly, the books of Ben Sirach and all the books written from then onwards do not make the hands impure. I'm not going to go into why this phrase means is a holy book and in the Bible, but actually that is exactly what it means. So if something makes the hands impure, rather counterintuitively, it is a holy book and it is in the Bible. If we have time in the questions, I can explain that if you want. Okay, so basically the books of Ben Sirach and all the books written from then onwards are not holy books. They're not in, which is a very blanket statement. Now, that only appears in this one place in rabbinic literature, but there may have been enough people who went with this view and just said, no, 1 Maccabees, 2, 3, 4, they're all written after 180 BCE. We're not interested in them. They cannot be holy books. And we also have this idea of there being a closed set of holy books from a somewhat later source, Midrash Kohelet Rabba, again, difficult to date, first few centuries CE, maybe. Anyone who brings into his house more than 24 books of scripture, such as the book of Ben Sirach, brings chaos into his home. So again, by this point, clearly it is a done deal. There are 24 books. But between those two texts, and earlier than those two texts, there was uncertainty as to what qualified as a really holy book or not. But I would argue that if Ben Sirach was being used as a cutoff point, that is a very major reason why even the first book of Maccabees, the very best contender, did not get into the Bible. Necessary for Hanukkah or not, it was too late. So that's element number 1. Element number 2 is language. As you know, all the books of Tanach are either in Hebrew or some sections are in Aramaic, but none of them are in Greek. So that would rule out 2, 3, and 4. Well, 3 we've already ruled out, but 2 and 4 seem to have been written originally in Greek. Very unlikely they would have been considered as candidates. That would leave book number 1, which was originally written in Hebrew. Interestingly, and if you want another little bit of evidence in the period, the Dead Sea Scrolls from Qumran do not have any traces of the first book of Maccabees at all. They have all the books of the Bible except Esther, which is interesting because Esther was disputed also whether that was in or out. And they also have the previously lost original Hebrew of Ben Sirach, but they don't have first Maccabees. So that's another argument against the fact that they date from about 150 BCE to about 73 CE when the settlement was destroyed. That by this period, the first Maccabees was already not really in the running. Holiness and star quality factors are a bit linked. A book had to feel like a biblical book. It had to feel like a holy book. And 1 Maccabees is historical. It's got the odd moral message, but its predominant feeling is that of a history book, a Greek history book with lots of elaborate speeches. It's a bit more perhaps like Ezra and Nehemiah, which are in Ketuvim because we need the history, but not generally typical of most biblical books. So that sort of holy feeling, it would have needed much more of the holy feeling or the star quality feeling to overcome the problem of date of composition. And it didn't have it, not in that stage, or in that, to that extent. And the last factor, I think, may be the most important, and that's that of politics and theology. Now, the Hasmonean dynasty started off very well, and they were seen, as we have been looking at, they've seen as saviors and the instruments of God's salvation and so on and so forth. They were shining examples of Jewish leadership by the time the first book of Maccabees was composed, but they started to go downhill later on. Later members of the dynasty were corrupt and mercenary and used to kill each other quite often, and killed innocent people and squabbled over who was going to be the next king. And it was, in fact, two Hasmonean brothers fighting over who should be king, who invited the Romans in 63 BCE. So their reputation had gone downhill. In addition, when we look at the rabbis' attitude to the Hasmoneans, they were fundamentally suspicious of them because they did something which was not okay. They united the function of priesthood, which is a privilege of the tribe of Levi, with the privilege of kingship, which belongs to the tribe of Yehuda, notably two descendants of David. And though they had been quite humble priests at first, they soon became high priests and kings combined, so that the same person would be both high priest and king, which is in complete contravention of everything the Bible says about separation of functions of tribes. And the rabbis were not very excited about that, you can imagine. So they're going completely against the rules. And that would certainly not have made the rabbis see them as positive examples and go, you know what, let's have First Maccabees in as a biblical book. So this attitude, this sort of ambiguity of the rabbis about the Hasmoneans is also very visible when we look at our liturgy. We'll see that it sort of glances off the Hasmoneans pretty quickly and focuses on God's miracles much, much more hard. And also, when we look at how rabbinic literature later on and in the Middle Ages, when we get past rabbinic literature, what are the elements of Hanukkah texts that get picked out? And they are the miracle stories, the message, the morals, the martyrdom, the high-mindedness of dying for your faith. All that is emphasized, and that becomes the focus. So we have various texts that were not connected with Hanukkah at all, like the Book of Judith, also in the Apocrypha, annexed to Hanukkah and redefined and re-understood as examples of what happened at Hanukkah. And they all tend to be martyrdom and moral stories and not military stories. And I told you last time, the famous story, the little jug of oil. That's a really good example that gets hugely promoted later on. We said its first appearance is either in Megillat Antiochus or in the Talmud, anywhere between the 2nd and the 7th centuries CE, i.e. a good 300 or 400 or even 500 years after the events of Hanukkah. And that's an absolutely typical example of the fact that the moral and spiritual dimensions of the events of Hanukkah get played up enormously by the rabbis as against the military aspects. The other reason for that would be that the rabbis are living under Roman domination. They are very keen to avoid Jews rising up and getting killed by the Romans all over again. They've seen too many examples. They've seen failed rebellions like the rebellion of Bar Kokhba. And the rabbis generally seem to prefer to encourage people to tone it down, accept that Roman domination was a result of their sins, and wait for God to save them in his own good time. So you're not going to promote a story that says, oh, these 5 brothers stood up and started killing officials of the government. It's a very anti-rabbinic message. So I think this is probably the most important factor as to why the book of, even number 1 book of Maccabees, did not get into the Bible and wasn't regarded as a holy text and wasn't seen as suitable for reading at Hanukkah. And we do have later texts like the Megillat Antiochus, which were read, for instance, in Italian shuls in, I think, the 15th, 16th centuries. For about a century, they were the text of Hanukkah, which didn't seem to have lasted, possibly because they weren't biblical books, or because they went slightly against this rabbinic feeling that, yeah, we'll talk about the miracles, but we don't really want to cry up the Hasmoneans too much. They're not really our sort of people. So I'm hoping that's provided an answer to the question of why are the books of the Maccabees not in the Bible. It's a combination of those things, and that's probably basically why we don't read the first book of Maccabees. But I would recommend reading it for fun, and Hanukkah is a good time to read it if you compare 15 to 16 chapters. A very good recent edition has been composed. I actually got it sitting around. No, I don't know where I put it. It's called the Jewish Annotated Apocrypha, and it came out, I think, last year. It's a wonderful book. They did a Jewish Annotated New Testament, which is fascinating, but the Jewish Annotated Apocrypha is excellent, and it does have 1st and 2nd Maccabees in there with a Jewish commentary all the way through and an introduction to it. So if you're thinking of, I must go and read it now, that's the edition to look for. Very recent, very readable, fabulous book with all sorts of exciting stuff about it. Okay, so let's have a little look at the queries in the comments. Somebody's asked, were the weddings open in secret? I presume this was the large gatherings or small or clandestine. Well, it's the story of 3rd Maccabees seems to be the Jewish community is carrying on as usual, which would imply open weddings and gatherings and whatever size they chose. And then suddenly the king takes against them and persecutes them. So I think it's just assumed it's a normal Jewish society that suddenly comes under persecution. Can I make any comparisons with Chabad's Tzivos Hashem, armies of God? Yes, that's exactly what they're doing. They're translating military metaphor to a spiritual plane as opposed to a physical plane. Though notably, quite a lot of Chabad do serve in the Israeli army. But yes, that's a very, very rabbinic tactic. As I say, it's not about swords, it's about God's support. We don't need swords really, which is again what the Haredi will very much say. What you have in the Israeli army, for God will protect us. Is 3rd Maccabees a counter narrative to the slander of Manetho? Manetho was an Egyptian priest who wrote a history of Egypt in, I can't remember when, but it's Hellenistic period, which is written in Greek, which was taken very, very seriously by ancient historians, though it's known that quite a lot of it is mythical, but on the other hand, it's what we've got. So very important to Egyptologists. When you say the slander of Manetho, I imagine, I've never read Manetho, I imagine it's probably he's rude about Jews. It might, if so, if that's what the slander refers to, and I simply don't know, yes, maybe it is. I don't know how well Manetho was known by the Jewish community. I've got no idea. I have no idea, but it's an interesting thing that maybe somebody has written about it. So I'll have to find out. Eric said, was the Hebrew version of Book 1 lost because it was not considered biblical, or was it not considered biblical because the Hebrew version was lost? I think it wasn't preserved because it wasn't considered biblical. Same with Ben Sira. We lost the Hebrew version very early on. It was found in the Cairo Geniza and then in the Dead Sea Scrolls, so that's exciting. So probably texts that are less important don't get copied so often and they don't survive. And so it's probably because it was not in the canon that it just sort of disappeared eventually. Thank you very much, Samira, for a lovely compliment. Jerry's written, were the rabbis uneasy with martyrdom and specifically codifying reasons for Hashem? They thought it was a good thing, but they didn't want mass martyrdom, really. The Bar Kokhba revolt took such an enormous toll on the Jewish population of the land of Israel and led to really the beginning of its decline. They did not want mass movements that were going to be with hundreds of thousands of people being slaughtered by the Romans. So whereas they thought that martyrdom was a good thing, they didn't want to put people in the situation where martyrdom was going to happen to them. So they did tend to take a sort of quietistic position and just say, obey the authorities, and were it not for the authorities, people would eat each other alive. And they do quite a bit of sort of tacit justifying of, this is the government we've got. They also go back to the Bible and go, if God sends you foreign domination, it's because you've done something wrong. So repent away, and eventually God will remove the foreign domination. You don't really need to fight. Because again, it's a policy decision, provoking people into mass revolt and possibly mass massacre, not really what they wanted to do. Was the book of Ruth, like Esther, up for dispute? No, Ruth was in. Everyone was happy with Ruth. Esther, there are people in the Mishnah who are not happy with Esther. So it's interesting that Ruth went straight in. I would guess that Esther was slightly problematic because it happens outside the land of Israel, and because Esther, oh my heavens, she gets married to a non-Jew. We don't hear about her eating kosher. Now, interestingly, there were Greek additions to the book of Esther that were written in the Hellenistic period that have her doing exactly that. Also, of course, Esther famously doesn't mention God. And the additions to Esther, which are in the Apocrypha, have her as a very frum person who is very careful about what she eats, deplores the fact that she's married to the king, does a lot of fasting and fainting, and prays at enormous length, like mad, all through the additions. So it's a way of sort of repairing the omissions from Esther. But those omissions made people uneasy, and I would guess that they might be the reason why some people weren't too sure whether Esther really qualified or not. Please repeat the book you mentioned with the Maccabees included. Oh, the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha is not a book so much as a section of the Christian Bible. Catholics and the Orthodox tend to be more enthusiastic about it, Protestants less. You will find it in some Protestant Bibles. And the Apocrypha, or the hidden books, is what it means in Greek, consists of a series of books, all of which were written by Jews in the Hellenistic period, which were not deemed to be part of the Bible by Jews, but were preserved in Greek by Christians, some of whom felt they were in the Bible. And again, different Christian denominations have different views on the Apocrypha. But our earliest text of the Greek Bible, the Septuagint, which comes from the 4th century CE and is the Codex Sinaiticus, which is down the road from me in the British Library, does have the Apocrypha and does have 1st and I think 2nd Maccabees in it, but not 3 and 4. So again, by the 4th century, Christians thought that was part of the Bible. And that's why the Apocrypha is quite important to us, because it shows us some of our candidates that didn't make it, but they got preserved by other people. So we know they were possibly, or some of them might have been in the running, like Ben Sira. So it's so yes, the book I was recommending is the annotated Jewish Apocrypha, or it could be the Jewish annotated Apocrypha. I think it's Oxford University Press. It's easy to find, and really excellent book. Enjoying it a lot. Okay, so are there any more questions at all? Where can we read 3 and 4? I think you can get them online, actually. Just pump in Maccabees 3, Maccabees 4. There are nice Wikipedia articles about them. They probably have links. It's not at all hard to find 3 and 4. If you can stomach 18 chapters of martyrdom stories, I mean, they're quite tough reads, I would say. Maybe good if you have insomnia. Any other questions? No? We see you're done? Okay, fantastic. That was fun.
This was wonderful. Thank you for joining us.
Very good. Enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Hope to
Thank
see
you
you all
so
again.
much. Chag Sameach.
Take
Thanks,
care.
Samir. Have a wonderful time.
Classes. We look forward to seeing you at another class, and Chag Sameach to everyone. Wishing you lots of light.
Bye-bye.
All the best, everyone.
Bye.
Chag Sameach.